A Scar That Whispered Secrets, Chapter 1, The Innocent Question. Newport, Rhode Island, 2024. Eleanor Vance, in her early 70s, sat on the porch swing, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the ancient oak that shaded her historic home. The scent of salt and honeysuckle filled the air, a familiar comfort. Her grandson, Leo, a bright, inquisitive 8-year-old, sat beside her, meticulously drawing a battleship in his sketchbook. He was a whirlwind of curiosity, a constant source of joy and occasional challenge. "Grandma," Leo piped up, his small finger tracing a faint, silvery line on her left forearm. "What's this? Is it a boo-boo?" Eleanor froze. Her heart gave a sudden, uncomfortable lurch. The scar. It was a thin, jagged line, barely noticeable, stretching from just below her wrist towards her elbow. A mark she had lived with for over 50 years. A silent testament to a past she had painstakingly buried. She usually kept it covered, either by the sleeve of her cardigan or in warmer weather by a wide bracelet. But today, in the relaxed warmth of the afternoon, she had forgotten. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a quick, harmless answer. The truth was too complex, too painful, too dangerous to even begin to explain to an innocent child. It was a truth she had actively suppressed, a chapter of her life ripped out and burned, the ashes scattered to the winds. "Oh, that, sweetie." Eleanor forced a light, dismissive laugh, her voice a little too high, a little too quick. "That's just from falling off my bike when I was a silly little girl, a long, long time ago. Tried to do a fancy trick and ended up with a scrape. Nothing to worry about." She gently pulled her sleeve down, covering the mark. Leo, thankfully, seemed satisfied, his attention already shifting back to the intricate details of his battleship. "Oh, okay." Eleanor watched him, a wave of relief washing over her, quickly followed by a chilling dread. She had lied. An innocuous lie, perhaps, meant to protect, to simplify. But as the sun dipped lower and painted the sky in hues of orange and violet, the lie began to fester. That night, she lay in bed, the comfortable silence of her room turning oppressive. The innocent question echoed in her mind, amplifying the ghost of the scar, making it throb with a phantom pain. And then the dreams began. They were fragmented at first. Flashes of harsh light, the metallic tang of something bitter, the unsettling sensation of being trapped. Each night, the dreams became more vivid, more insistent, pulling her back to a time and a place she had deliberately forgotten. A place filled with cold, with fear, with a piercing sense of loss. The scar, once a faded mark, was now a gateway, forced open by an innocent question, leading her into the dark, unexplored corridors of her own repressed past. The comfortable peace of her life was gone, replaced by a haunting reality that refused to be silenced. The lie had opened a door, and through it, the nightmares of a forgotten time were pouring in, demanding to be seen, to be heard, to be confronted. Chapter 2, The Nightmare's Insistent Call. The dreams were relentless, a nightly assault on Eleanor's carefully constructed peace. They were not vague or fleeting. They were sharp, visceral, pulling her back with terrifying force. The initial flashes of harsh, fluorescent light now coalesced into a sterile, cold room. The metallic tang became the unmistakable scent of antiseptic. The sensation of being trapped intensified into a suffocating pressure, the feeling of restraints, and always the chilling cold, a pervasive chill that settled deep in her bones. Each morning, Eleanor woke drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, the phantom echo of a scream lodged in her throat. Her beautiful, sun-drenched home, usually a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell, barely protecting her from the horrors that pursued her in sleep. The lie she had told Leo, meant to be a simple evasion, had instead acted as a key, unlocking a door she had meticulously bolted and barred for over 5 decades. She tried to rationalize it. Stress, perhaps. The natural anxieties of aging. But the dreams felt too real, too specific. They weren't symbolic. They felt like memories, brutally reasserting themselves. The scar on her forearm, once an almost invisible line, now seemed to burn, a tangible connection to the nightmares. She found herself subconsciously rubbing it, as if trying to erase it, or perhaps trying to understand it. Eleanor began to seek solace in routine, in the familiar. She tended her rose garden with renewed vigor, the earthy scent a grounding force against the ethereal terror of her nights. She baked her famous apple pie, the warmth of the oven and the scent of cinnamon a comforting shield. But even these small comforts were infiltrated. A specific shade of green in the leaves of a rose bush would suddenly morph into the sickly green of institutional walls. The metallic clang of a pie tin would echo the chilling sound of a locked door. One night, a new detail emerged in the nightmare. A face, a young woman, her eyes wide with fear, her dark hair tangled. She was clutching something small and bundled, pressing it to her chest, whispering frantically. Eleanor couldn't hear the words, but the fear in the woman's eyes was palpable, a mirror of her own terror. And then, a shadow, tall and menacing, looming over them. The dreams always ended abruptly, before any real clarity, leaving Eleanor gasping, disoriented, and deeply shaken. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that these weren't just nightmares. They were fragments of a forgotten past, a past that held the key to the scar and to the innocent question that had unleashed this torment. The scar was not from a bicycle accident. It was from something far more sinister, something that had left a permanent mark not just on her flesh, but on her very soul. Eleanor had always been fiercely independent, a woman who prided herself on her strength and self-reliance. She had faced challenges in her life, losses, heartbreaks, but nothing had ever shaken her like this. This wasn't something she could fix with logic or determination. This was something buried deep within her, demanding to be unearthed. The memory of her parents, her loving, traditional parents, who had always been so protective, so seemingly transparent. They had always told her she had a normal, happy childhood. But now, in the relentless grip of these dreams, a sliver of doubt began to creep in. Had they known something? Had they been part of the lie? It was an unbearable thought, but the dreams left no room for comfortable illusions. The nightmares were no longer just a torment. They were an insistent call, a desperate plea from a forgotten self, begging her to remember, to understand, to confront the unspeakable truth hidden within the scar. Eleanor knew she couldn't ignore them any longer. She had to seek answers, no matter how terrifying the truth might be. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Memory Lane. The relentless nightmares had stripped away Eleanor's complacency, leaving her raw and exposed. She could no longer dismiss the scar as a bicycle injury. The fragmented images of cold rooms, restraints, and a terrified young woman with a bundled child were too vivid, too persistent. She needed to understand. She needed to remember. Her immediate instinct was to consult a doctor, perhaps a neurologist, to rule out any underlying medical cause for these vivid night terrors. The specialist listened patiently to Eleanor's account, ran a battery of tests, and finally, gently, suggested that while there was no obvious physical cause, the vividness and recurring nature of her dreams, coupled with the long-standing scar and her emotional distress, might point to repressed traumatic memory. He recommended a therapist specializing in trauma and memory recovery. Eleanor hesitated. Therapy was for other people, for those who couldn't cope. But the nightmares were robbing her of sleep, of peace, of her very sense of self. Desperate, she agreed. Dr. Anya Sharma was a kind, perceptive woman in her late 40s, with a calm demeanor and empathetic eyes. Eleanor, initially guarded, found herself slowly opening up, recounting the dreams, the scar, the innocent question from Leo, and the lie that had shattered her peace. "Tell me about the scar, Eleanor," Dr. Sharma prompted gently in their third session. "What do you feel when you touch it? What comes to mind, however vague?" Eleanor closed her eyes, her fingers tracing the faint line. A flash of sharp, searing pain. Not the dull ache of an old wound, but a memory of fresh, agonizing agony. And with it, a fragmented image, a glint of metal, a sterile white surface, and a sharp, sudden pull. "A needle," Eleanor whispered, her eyes still closed, a shiver running down her spine. "A very long needle, and cold metal, a table." Dr. Sharma nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And the cold rune, the young woman?" Eleanor described the recurring dream, the terrified young woman, the bundled child. "She's trying to protect the baby," Eleanor murmured, a profound sadness in her voice. "She's so afraid. For the baby." As Eleanor spoke, new details began to surface, triggered by the safe, controlled environment of the therapy sessions. The dreams now featured whispered conversations she couldn't quite discern, the muffled sound of a crying baby, and the chilling click of a lock. The dominant emotion was one of absolute powerlessness, a crushing fear that transcended her adult understanding. One afternoon, during a particularly intense session, Eleanor suddenly sat upright. "The uniform," she said, her voice strained. "The shadow. It's a uniform. Dark blue and a cap, like a guard. And the setting, it wasn't just a cold room. It was a sterile, impersonal place, an institution." Dr. Sharma listened, making careful notes. "Eleanor, sometimes traumatic memories, especially from early childhood, are fragmented precisely because the mind tries to protect itself. Your mind may be ready now to process this. Have you ever considered where you were born? Or any unusual circumstances surrounding your birth?" Eleanor had always known she was born in a small private hospital outside of Providence, Rhode Island. Her parents had always said it was a complicated birth, and they had kept her home for the first few months. She never questioned it. Now she did. A complicated birth? Or something else entirely? The therapist encouraged Eleanor to look for tangible links, to revisit her past, perhaps not just through her own memories, but through external records. Sometimes, physical places can unlock memories, Dr. Sharma suggested. "Do you have your birth certificate? Or perhaps old family documents, letters, anything from that time?" Eleanor realized she had her original birth certificate, filed away in a strongbox in her attic, alongside other important family papers. It was a simple, mundane document she had never thought to scrutinize. Now, armed with new questions, Eleanor felt a terrifying urgency to find it. The ghost of memory lane was calling, beckoning her to confront the truth hidden in plain sight, a truth that promised to redefine her entire life. The journey into her past, however painful, had begun in earnest. Chapter 4: The Unraveling Threads. The therapy sessions, while emotionally draining, were slowly pulling at the tangled threads of Eleanor's repressed past. Dr. Sharma, working and pulling at all the tangled threads. Dr. Sharma asks Eleanor to find some tangible links. Dr. Sharma nodded in several instances, making careful notes, and then he has her open to revisiting her past. Chapter 4: The Unraveling Threads. The therapy sessions, while emotionally draining, were slowly pulling at the tangled threads of Eleanor's repressed past. Dr. Sharma listened, making careful notes, to revisit her past, perhaps not just through her own memories, but through external records. Sometimes traumatic memories like real actions. The Chapter 4: The Unraveling Threads. All the threads that trained unmown truth are desperate to redefine them. Sharma's gentle guidance and the safe space she provided allowed Eleanor to delve deeper into the fragments of her nightmares, each session bringing a new, unsettling detail to the surface. The scar, the cold, the uniform, the crying baby. They were not random images, but pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Armed with Dr. Sharma's suggestion to scrutinize her birth certificate, Eleanor ventured into her attic, a dusty repository of family history. The old wooden strongbox, usually reserved for important papers and sentimental trinkets, felt heavy in her hands. Inside, beneath layers of faded photographs and dried corsages, lay her birth certificate. She unfolded the yellowed document, her hands trembling. Her name, Eleanor Ann Vance. Date of birth, April 12, 1953. Place of birth, St. Jude's Home for Unwed Mothers, Providence, Rhode Island. St. Jude's Home for Unwed Mothers. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her parents had always told her she was born in a small private hospital. The lie was glaring, stark, undeniable. And unwed mothers. This wasn't a hospital for complicated births. This was a place for desperate young women. A wave of nausea washed over her. This revelation, more than any dream, felt like a betrayal. Her loving, traditional parents. They had kept this from her. Why? And what did it mean for her own story? Was the young woman in her dreams her biological mother? And the baby, was it her? Or another child? She immediately brought the birth certificate to her next therapy session. Dr. Sharma studied it carefully. Eleanor, this changes things significantly. St. Jude's was indeed a home for unwed mothers, common in that era. Many women were sent there in secret by their families to give birth, often under duress, and their babies were subsequently adopted. The practice was often shrouded in secrecy and shame. The pieces began to click with chilling precision. The cold, sterile room. The feeling of being trapped. The subtle hints of institutional control. The long needle. Was it for a sedative? To make her comply? The terrified young woman, her biological mother, forced to give up her child. Dr. Sharma studied it carefully. Sharma suggested Eleanor try to find records from St. Jude's home. It may be difficult, she warned. Many of these institutions' records are sealed, or were poorly kept, or even deliberately destroyed to protect the identities of the mothers and children. But it's your right to know your origins. Eleanor began her research. She found that St. Jude's had closed down in the late 1970s. Its building now converted into luxury condominiums, but some of its records had been transferred to a local historical society. It was a long shot, but it was her only lead. The Historical Society was a quiet, dusty place, filled with the echoes of forgotten lives. The archivist, a kind but reserved woman, informed Eleanor that St. Jude's records were indeed highly restricted. Many families wanted absolute privacy, she explained. We can only release information under very specific legal circumstances, or if the individual themselves comes forward seeking their own records. Eleanor explained her story, the dreams, the scar, the birth certificate. She presented her ID, proving she was indeed Eleanor Ann Vance, born at St. Jude's. The archivist, moved by Eleanor's obvious distress and the unusual circumstances, agreed to search for her specific file, stressing that it might be incomplete or contain very little information. The wait was agonizing. Days turned into weeks. The dreams continued, now more urgent, infused with a new sense of purpose. The young woman's face was clearer, her eyes pleading, her dark hair long and flowing. She was whispering, but the words remained just out of reach, muffled by time and the lingering fog of memory. Then a call from the Historical Society. They had found something. A file, surprisingly intact, containing not just her birth records, but additional notes and a few unexpected items. Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with a chilling dread. The threads of her life, once tightly wound and deceptively simple, were now unraveling, revealing a complex, perhaps terrifying, pattern beneath. She was about to confront the deepest secret of her existence, a secret held not just by her adoptive parents, but by the very institution that brought her into the world. Chapter 5: The St. Jude's Revelation. Eleanor drove to the Historical Society with a knot of anticipation and dread in her stomach. The call had been succinct. They had found her file from St. Jude's Home for Unwed Mothers, and it contained more than just basic birth information. This was it, the moment she had simultaneously longed for and feared. The archivist, a gentle woman named Ms. Davies, led Eleanor to a quiet, secluded reading room. On the polished oak table lay a single, thin manila folder. It looked unassuming, yet it held the potential to shatter everything Eleanor thought she knew. "We found this," Ms. Davies said softly, her voice respectful of the gravity of the moment. "It's your intake file from St. Jude's. It contains details about your biological mother and the circumstances surrounding your birth and adoption." Eleanor took a deep breath and opened the folder. The first page was a standard intake form detailing her biological mother's information. Name: Catherine Kate Miller. Age: 17. Address: rural Vermont. Address listed, but now likely long gone. Notes: quiet, compliant, distressed. Delivered healthy female infant. Resisted relinquishment initially. Required sedation prior to signing. Required sedation prior to signing. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The long needle, the feeling of powerlessness, the fear in the young woman's eyes, in her dreams. It wasn't just a memory. It was a horrifying truth. Her biological mother, Kate, had been sedated to force her to give up her baby. A new wave of anger, fierce and righteous, swept over Eleanor, directed not at Kate, but at the cruel, unfeeling system that had orchestrated such a betrayal. She continued to read, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The next document was a medical record detailing her birth. Then, another page, a social worker's note. Infant Jane Doe, approximately 3 days old, presented with unexplained laceration to left forearm. Laceration is clean, consistent with a surgical incision, but no surgical records on file for infant or mother. Wound cleaned, stitched. Cause unknown. Prognosis excellent. The scar. This was it. Not a bicycle accident. Not a scrape. A surgical incision on an infant with no record. An unexplained wound. But why? The mystery deepened, even as one was solved. Beneath these documents, tucked away, were two additional items: a small, tightly folded piece of paper and a tiny, tarnished silver locket. Eleanor carefully unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten note in delicate, hurried script, faded with age, but still legible. My dearest Jennifer, if you ever read this, know that I loved you more than life itself. They are making me give you up. They say it's for your own good, that I'm too young, too poor, too everything. But I wanted you. I fought for you. Please, forgive me, and never forget. The locket, it has a piece of my heart. Hold on to it. Your father, he's waiting for us. I hope one day we can find each other. Be brave. Be kind. Always, your mama, Kate. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jennifer, her real name, spoken aloud by her biological mother, Kate. The name from the FBI file, the name Matthew's contact had mentioned, a name she had heard in her dreams. It was her. The baby, the one her mother was trying to protect, was her. And the locket. She picked up the tiny silver heart, tarnished with time. It had a delicate engraving on one side, almost worn away, a tiny, stylized bird, perhaps a swallow. On the other side, an initial, J, for Jennifer. Suddenly, a torrent of memories, sharper and more coherent than any dream, flooded Eleanor's mind. She was no longer watching from afar. She was there. The cold room, the long needle, the burn as the sedative entered her tiny infant body. The muffled cries, not just hers, but another baby's. Kate, her mother, desperate, weeping, holding her tight, pressing the locket into her tiny hand. The shadow of the uniformed man, a social worker or a nurse, looming. And then the sharp, sudden pain as her mother's hand was forcefully pulled away, and a frantic, hurried incision made on Eleanor's arm. Why? Was it a last, desperate mark? A way to remember? Or a final, cruel act to ensure she couldn't be easily traced? Eleanor knew, with chilling certainty, that the wound had been inflicted after her mother was sedated, perhaps to quickly remove a birthmark or something else that might identify her, to ensure a clean slate for adoption. Or perhaps it was a desperate, final attempt by Kate herself to leave a permanent, unchangeable mark, a silent scream of defiance, a way for her daughter to remember. The scar. A deliberate act. Miss Davies, seeing Eleanor's profound distress, offered a glass of water. "Eleanor," she said gently, "I believe your mother tried to fight. Many of them did. And the scar, perhaps it was a desperate measure, or a last act of defiance." "My father," Eleanor whispered, her voice raw. "Kate said my father was waiting. Did they ever find him? Did she find him?" Miss Davies shook her head. "There's no further information on him here." St. Jude's focused solely on the mothers admitted. The file from St. Jude's had answered so many questions, but it had opened new, even more profound ones. Who was her father? Did Kate ever find him? Did she live a life burdened by the loss of her child? And why the scar? A mark of pain, a mark of resistance, a mark of love. Eleanor, now Jennifer, knew her journey was far from over. She had to find Kate. She had to find her father. She had to understand the full story behind the scar, the locket, and the name that had been stolen from her. The unraveling threads had finally revealed the true beginning of her life, a beginning steeped in tragedy, sacrifice, and an enduring, desperate love. Chapter 6: The Architect of Hope. The revelations from the St. Jude's file had been devastating, yet liberating. Eleanor now knew her true name was Jennifer, and her biological mother, Kate Miller, had been a terrified 17-year-old, forced to surrender her child. The scar, a raw incision inflicted during that agonizing separation, was no mere accident, but a visceral symbol of a brutal, unchosen destiny. It was a wound that finally made sense, a silent scream etched into her flesh. Her anger, initially directed at the system that had coerced her mother, now morphed into a fierce determination. She had to find Kate, and her father, the man Kate had mentioned, the one who was waiting for us. Eleanor, or rather Jennifer, now understood why the dreams had been so persistent. Her mind, recognizing the truth within the scar, was pushing her to reclaim the fragments of that traumatic infant memory. Dr. Sharma affirmed this, guiding her through exercises to integrate these fragmented memories, to allow them to surface safely. The cold room, the restraints, the muffled cries, the shadow of the uniformed figure. They were all part of her origin story, a painful but essential truth. The first step was to trace Kate Miller. The St. Jude's file had listed a rural Vermont address, but that was over 50 years ago. Eleanor started with genealogical websites, cross-referencing names, birth dates, and the slim details she had. It was a painstaking, often frustrating process. Kate Miller was a common name, and the trail was cold. She realized she needed professional help, someone skilled in tracing lost persons. She found a private investigator specializing in adoption searches, a seasoned woman named Sarah Jenkins, whose empathetic yet tenacious approach resonated with Eleanor. Sarah started by following the scant clues from the St. Jude's file. She contacted Vermont historical societies, searched old property deeds, and delved into archived phone books. The rural Vermont address was indeed long gone, the land now part of a larger protected forest. Kate Miller had seemingly vanished into thin air after leaving St. Jude's. These unwed mother cases are some of the hardest, Sarah admitted over a grainy video call. Families often cut ties completely. Many young women changed their names, moved far away, trying to erase the shame and trauma. It's like searching for a ghost. But Eleanor had Kate's letter, that tiny, faded piece of defiance. "My dearest Jennifer, your father, he's waiting for us." This indicated a hope, a plan, a continued connection. "Is there any way to trace the locket?" Eleanor asked, holding up the tarnished silver bird, the swallow on it, and the J. Sarah suggested they research jewelers in the Providence area who might have made such a custom piece in the early 1950s. It was a long shot, but worth pursuing. Simultaneously, Sarah broadened her search for Kate, expanding beyond Vermont, looking for anyone born in the early 1930s, Kate's approximate birth year, based on her being 17 in 1953 with the surname Miller, who might have connections to activist or counterculture movements of the late 60s, early 70s. Remembering the context of her adoptive parents' story and the political climate. Then another breakthrough, unexpectedly. Sarah found a distant obituary from a small-town newspaper in upstate New York, dated 2010. It was for a Catherine Kate Vance. The maiden name listed was Miller, and the obituary mentioned that she was survived by her beloved husband, Robert Vance. Vance, Eleanor's adoptive surname. The coincidence was too profound to be ignored. Robert Vance. Could this be her father, the one Kate was waiting for? Had Kate found him? Had they somehow been together, unbeknownst to Eleanor, her adoptive parents, and the secret that bound them? Sarah quickly traced Robert Vance. He was still alive, a widower living alone in a small cottage in a quiet, rural town in upstate New York, not far from where the obituary was published. He was in his early 90s, a retired history professor, living a quiet academic life. The pieces began to fall into place with chilling precision. The discovery ignited a new wave of questions. Why had Kate changed her name to Vance if Robert Vance was her father? Had they married later in life? Was he a different kind of father, a protector, a mentor? And if Kate had lived a full life, had she ever thought of Jennifer? Had she ever tried to find her? Eleanor felt a surge of hope, tempered by the knowledge that this encounter would be equally fraught with emotion. She was no longer just the product of a secret adoption. She was Jennifer, seeking the truth from the very architects of her life. She was prepared for whatever answers Robert Vance might hold, knowing that finally, after all these years, the full story of the scar and the name Jennifer was within her grasp. The journey, from a simple lie to a complex historical quest, was nearing its astonishing, life-altering climax. Chapter 7. Robert's Confession. The drive to upstate New York felt less like a journey and more like a pilgrimage. Eleanor, accompanied by Sarah Jenkins, the private investigator who had become an invaluable ally, was consumed by a nervous energy that transcended mere anticipation. Robert Vance, the name from Kate's obituary. Was he her biological father, or something else entirely? The possibility that her biological mother had lived a full life, perhaps with the man she loved, while Eleanor lived under a fabricated identity, was a complex emotional landscape to navigate. They found Robert Vance's small cottage nestled amongst rolling hills, surrounded by a tangle of overgrown rose bushes and towering oak trees. It was a tranquil, almost idyllic setting, a stark contrast to the turbulent, hidden past they were about to unearth. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. Sarah, ever practical, approached the door first, giving Eleanor a moment to compose herself. She knocked gently. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an old man, frail but with a surprising alertness in his clear blue eyes. His hair was thin and white, but his posture, even at his advanced age, held a certain scholarly dignity. "Mr. Vance," Sarah began politely, "my name is Sarah Jenkins, and this is Eleanor Vance. We believe we have some questions about Catherine Miller, Kate Vance." Robert Vance's eyes, initially curious, suddenly widened. His gaze fixed on Eleanor, a profound shock, then a flicker of recognition passing across his face. He seemed to see not just Eleanor, but a ghost from his past, a vivid echo. He stepped back, a trembling hand rising to his mouth. "Eleanor, you said Eleanor Vance?" Eleanor stepped forward, holding out the tarnished silver locket. "Yes, Mr. Vance. My name is Eleanor Ann Vance, but my birth name, my mother called me Jennifer. My biological mother, Kate Miller, gave me this locket. She wrote me a letter. She said her father was waiting for us." Robert Vance's eyes filled with tears. He slowly took the locket, his aged fingers tracing the tiny swallow engraving. Then the initial J, his jaw trembled. "Jennifer," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Kate, she never stopped looking for you. Never." He invited them inside, his movements slow, deliberate. They sat in his cozy, book-lined living room, the air heavy with unspoken history. Robert, his voice raspy with age and emotion, began to tell his story. "Kate was my younger sister," he confessed, his words a revelation that stunned Eleanor. "Not my daughter, my sister, Catherine Miller. I was much older, already a university student when she was born. We were very close, even with the age gap. She was fiercely intelligent, a true artist, and terribly naive in some ways." He explained that Kate had indeed fallen in love with a young activist, the charismatic, passionate man named David Shaw, not Ethan Cole. David was a leader in the anti-war movement, Robert explained, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He believed deeply in justice, but he was reckless. He was under heavy government surveillance, just like many others. He knew his time was limited. When Kate became pregnant, David was ecstatic, but terrified for their future. They wanted to marry, to raise their child, but the risks were too high. David feared imprisonment, or worse, that their child would be taken from them. They devised a desperate plan. Kate would go to St. Jude's, ostensibly to give up the baby, creating a paper trail of a conventional adoption. But in truth, David planned to retrieve the baby shortly after birth, and then they would all disappear together, living underground, using assumed identities. But the plan went terribly wrong, Robert recounted, his voice breaking. Kate was heavily sedated at St. Jude's. She resisted giving you up, fought with everything she had. They wanted a clean, easy adoption, no complications. And David, he never made it to St. Jude's. He was arrested days before your birth, implicated in a major anti-government protest, sentenced to a long prison term. Kate was utterly alone, heartbroken, drugged. They forced her to sign the papers. Eleanor listened, tears streaming down her face. The scar, she whispered, holding up her arm. What happened? Robert looked at the scar, his eyes filled with a fresh wave of grief. Kate, she believed they tried to remove a unique birthmark you had on your arm. A small, distinctive red mark. Something that might identify you later, or connect you to her. She told me she felt a strange, sharp tug after she was sedated. Sheila's convinced they did it to ensure a clean, untraceable adoption, to erase a part of you. He confirmed the locket was a gift from Kate to David, engraved with a swallow, their symbol of freedom. She had pressed it into Jennifer's hand in a desperate, final act before the sedation fully took hold. Robert had tried to help Kate. He was her only confidant, her anchor. He tracked down the Ashtons, hoping to discreetly check on Jennifer. They were wonderful people, he said, his voice softer. They loved you, Jennifer, truly. Kate and I saw you grow up from a distance, saw you thriving, loved and cared for. It broke her heart every day, but she knew you were safe. She clung to that. She believed it was for the best. Kate had gone on to live a quiet life, haunted by the past, but always hoping one day to find Jennifer, to explain. She never did. She died 10 years ago, her final wish to find her daughter unfulfilled. So my parents, the Ashtons, they didn't lie out of malice, Eleanor murmured, a new understanding dawning. They didn't know the full truth. They truly believed I was an orphan from a fire, and my biological parents, Kate and David, they were protecting me, and they both carried that burden their whole lives. Robert Vance, her uncle, now her only living link to her biological family, nodded, his eyes filled with profound sadness and relief. Yes, Jennifer, they all loved you, in different ways, but deeply. You were protected by love, and by a secret so profound it defined lives. The truth was more complex, more tragic, and more beautiful than anything Eleanor had imagined. The scar, a symbol of trauma, was also a testament to her mother's desperate, enduring love. Her identity, once a lie, was now a rich tapestry woven with threads of sacrifice, love, and the echoes of a turbulent, hidden past. The reckoning was complete, but the healing, the weaving of these disparate threads into a coherent whole had just begun. Chapter 8: Threads of Forgiveness. The revelation that Robert Vance was her uncle, not her biological father, and that her biological father was David Shaw, a political activist jailed shortly after her birth, added another layer of complexity to Eleanor's, now Jennifer's, already convoluted history. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, each fragment revealing a deeper, more poignant truth. The scar, the locket, the names, it all connected to a narrative of desperate love, painful sacrifice, and a pervasive societal fear that had shaped her very existence. Jennifer spent weeks with Robert, her newly found uncle. He was a treasure trove of information, filling in the gaps of Kate and David's lives. He showed her old photographs, a vibrant, rebellious Kate, her eyes full of fire and idealism, a handsome, intense David, his arm around Kate, their smiles radiant with young love and unwavering conviction. Jennifer saw her own eyes, her own mouth in their faces. She was unmistakably their daughter. Robert explained that Kate had visited David in prison for years, their bond unbroken despite the bars. David had always known about Jennifer, about the plan gone awry. He had held on to the hope of being reunited with his daughter, even from behind walls. But his health had deteriorated in prison, and he had died there in the late 1980s, never having met his daughter as an adult, never having told her his side of the story. Kate carried that grief, that burden, every single day, Robert said, his voice soft. The guilt of losing you, the pain of losing David. But she found a quiet life here, a peaceful existence. She never stopped thinking of you, Jennifer, and she knew, from watching you from afar, that you were loved, that you were safe. And that was her comfort. Jennifer learned about David's ideals, his unwavering commitment to peace and justice, which mirrored some of her own deeply held beliefs. She felt a connection to him, a sense of inherited purpose, a legacy of conviction. Her artistic inclinations, her quiet strength, her passion for fairness, they all seemed to echo traits she now recognized in Kate and David. The scar. Robert confirmed Kate's belief. It was a crude attempt by someone at St. Jude's to remove a distinctive birthmark, likely a small, star-shaped mark, to ensure Jennifer's anonymity for adoption. It was a cruel, clinical act meant to sever any physical link to her past, ironically becoming the very link that led her back. Jennifer returned to Newport, armed with her complete history. The nightmares had ceased. The scar no longer burned. It pulsed with a quiet, profound significance. It was a mark of survival, a testament to her mother's enduring love, and a symbol of the strength she had unknowingly carried within her. Her conversations with her adoptive parents took on a new depth. They cried together, forgiving each other for the secrets, for the pain. They understood that their actions, born of love and grief, had given Jennifer a stable, nurturing home. They were relieved the truth was out, that their burden was lifted. You were always our Eleanor, our sweet girl, her mother whispered, tears in her eyes. And now you are Jennifer too. Our family just got bigger and richer. Jennifer shared her story with her husband and children. Her husband, always her unwavering support, listened with awe and compassion. Leo, now older and more understanding, listened intently to the saga of the scar, the locket, and the extraordinary choices that had shaped his grandmother's life. He traced the scar on her arm, no longer with childish curiosity, but with a newfound reverence. "So, Grandma," Leo asked one evening, his young eyes earnest, "you're not Eleanor? You're Jennifer? Is that confusing?" Jennifer smiled, pulling him closer. "No, sweetie, it's not confusing. It's like having two beautiful names and two incredible stories. Eleanor is who your grandparents made me with all their love, and Jennifer is who I was born to be, with a brave mother who loved me so much she made the hardest choice. The scar, it reminds me of all of it. It's part of who I am. It tells a story of love, even in pain." She decided to honor her biological parents. She started a small scholarship fund in Kate and David's names at a local arts college, supporting students who showed passion for social justice through creative expression. She joined a support group for adopted adults seeking their birth families, offering her own story as a beacon of hope and resilience. Eleanor Vance, the architect, continued her work, her designs infused with a deeper understanding of human stories and the spaces that hold them. But now she also carried the name Jennifer, a whisper of a past reclaimed, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the transformative nature of love. The scar, once a source of nightmares and a secret lie, had become a profound symbol of identity, a badge of honor, and a conduit for forgiveness. It reminded her that even the deepest wounds, when confronted with courage and love, can become powerful marks of profound healing and completeness. The whispers of the past had finally spoken their truth, and Eleanor, now Jennifer, was finally, truly free.